Well, hi again to another episode from the Bible Bunker. This is Ed Rudiger, and I'm glad you're tuning in to engage in a little Bible discussion. Now, as y'all know, I've been talking about the gospel, or we've been talking about the Gospel of Mark, and we've been right now in the first half of the gospel where Mark establishes who Jesus is as the Christ. Remember in Mark chapter 1, verse 1, Mark gives us the structure of his book. He tells us what it's about. It's the gospel, the evangelion of Jesus, who is the Christ and who is also Son of God. And he spends the first part of his gospel establishing Jesus as the Christ. And that's kind of what we've been looking at these last few weeks. And we're actually in the seventh session. So this will be the seventh one, where we've been looking at what it means to say Jesus is the Christ, at least according to the evangelist Mark. Now, I've mentioned this before. I just want you to remember it. Each of the evangelists is approaching Jesus in a slightly different way. And each of the evangelists, being their own writer, is structuring their story about Jesus, their good news about Jesus, in a slightly different way. The other evangelists don't have that same uh, two-sided structure that Mark is using to present Christ. They're approaching it in a slightly different way. For example, in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew tends to group things together. He puts the teachings together, the miracles together, the parables together. Luke his gospel is the first volume of a two-volume set, one dealing with Jesus and the other dealing with the church, the book of Acts. And there's a lot of parallel between the two. John has this very clear structure where Jesus comes down, lives, is lifted up on the cross, and returns to the Father. All of them are presenting Jesus in their own way, because each of them view him in a slightly, or his importance in a slightly different way. All of them are presenting Jesus as the Son of God, but each of them puts a slightly different emphasis on what that means. And so when we're looking at the Gospel of Mark, as I've said before, we want to stay in Mark. We don't want to bring in stuff from the other Gospels. What it does is it distracts us from the point Mark is trying to make. And as we look at the canon, as we look at Scripture, we want to be aware of the point he's making and not necessarily a watered down version. It's kind of like if we look at historical figures. We probably don't want to combine two biographies of any historical figure. If we do that, we're going to miss what each individual writer, how they understand the person. So we want to do that with the Gospels. Now, we're in Mark, so we're looking at how Mark writes it. Now, we the reader, there are different groups in Mark, we the reader being one, but we're not the only ones. And we the reader have a special insight into what's going on. We have a special insight into who Jesus is, because Mark tells us things that the people in the story don't know. We know motivations, and the people in the story don't. We know what's inside of hearts. People in the story don't know. They're just people living, right? We also have heard things that people in the story may not have heard or may not have understood. I mean, right at the beginning, we heard God say that Jesus was his beloved Son. That was a message that only Jesus heard, because he used second person, but we overheard it. So right at the beginning, we've got this sense. Well, in the first verse, Mark tells us Jesus is Son of God. But that's not something that the people in the story have encountered. In fact, every time a demon says, "You're the Son of God," hey, you're the Son of God, Jesus says, "Be quiet," because he's not revealing that yet. What it means to be Son of God is going to be slightly different than what he's talking about right now. But we know it. So we are not really in the story. We're kind of observing the story, okay, from God's perspective. All right. Now, as we look at the story itself, we've got certain figures. We've got a very clear protagonist, a very clear hero, and that hero is Jesus Christ, right? So we've got Jesus as the one who is driving. This is his story. This is his good news. So we got Jesus on one side. We've got antagonists on the other. And when we think about antagonists, who is the opposition? Who makes up the opposition? Well, it's the Pharisees. And they've kind of gotten into league with the Herodians, although we haven't heard a lot about the Herodians. We did a little bit during the last session, but not a whole lot. It is the Pharisees that are the principal opponents to Jesus. Understand historically, as Mark is writing his gospel and presenting it to a church, sometime around the year 70, probably the time that the temples destroyed, the rebellion in Palestine. You don't have Sadducee is another sect in Judaism outside of Jerusalem. And in fact, after the rebellion, Sadducees kind of disappear because the temple's torn down and the Sadducees are focused on the temple. So as Mark writes his gospel, he writes the enemy as being Pharisee Jews, because they're the only Jews left when he's writing it. Okay, so those are the antagonists, and Mark tells us exactly why the Pharisee Jews don't like Jesus, in fact want to kill him, is he did something good on the Sabbath. And Mark is very intentional in emphasizing that. There's no other reason why they want to get him. It isn't heresy. It isn't theological. It doesn't have to do with ethics at all. It has everything to do with the law. And so the Pharisees on the other side. So we got Jesus here, we got Pharisees here, and then we got all these folks in the middle. And some of them are closer to Jesus and some of them are further away. For instance, we've got who in the group in the middle are closest to Jesus? Well, it's the 12, right? And he's already sent them out, and he's already told them what they can expect, lessons that Mark's church can take in. So we got the 12 that are close to Jesus. They don't know who he is, though, yet, at least not fully. They appreciate what he can do. They responded immediately as they were called, and like we'll look at this week, they're going to see some more miracles, but they really don't understand who Jesus is yet as both Christ and Son of God. But they are certainly closer to him than this other group, and the other group are the crowds. And we really got to take the crowds as sort of like one unit, because they aren't differentiated very much. Now we got some people in the crowds who are healed, but they don't come off looking very good. Because remember when he talks about the healing, you've been healed, you've been made whole. Don't tell anybody. Generally what they do is go and tell everybody. And so the people in the crowds they're amazed by him, they're hanging with him, but they don't understand it. Not yet. They really don't. And yet the Pharisees are concerned about him. The Pharisees don't know where the crowds stand. We, the reader, we kind of understand that the crowds are sort of there in the background. All right. Now, as we've gone through these, first 6 chapters or so, we've seen Jesus do a lot of stuff, all of which I think reflects how Mark sees the Christ. I mean, what are some of the things he's done? He's been healing, right? He's done a lot of healing. He's casting out demons, showing he has authority. He stilled the storm. Remember that story? He's taught lessons, particularly about the world that disciples can face as they take his message out. Okay, so he's done all that. And do you remember the response he's getting, what the crowds respond to him? Consistently, they are amazed by his teaching. They are astonished. He's had some hiccups, though. We looked at last time, in the last session, when he goes to his hometown. Remember what happened then? He wasn't able to do the same kind of miracles, or at least they didn't appreciate what he was doing. Mark says he was still doing it, they just didn't see it as miraculous. And remember, he kind of redefines family, which says that the people closest to him aren't the physically closest to him, or in the past have been emotionally closest to him, aren't the spiritually closest to him, which actually makes us feel good later because we are not biologically part of his family, but for Jesus, we are very close. Okay, so that's what we've established. Last time we looked at Herod and John the Baptist. Herod getting rid of John the Baptist. So John is out of the picture, and we are focused on Jesus. And as we go through chapter 6 and chapter 7, Mark is continuing to establish Jesus as this Christ, this worker of power, which again is only half of Jesus' story because he's also Son of God. And we'll get to that a little later. Now, in the section we're looking at, we're going to be dealing with 3 different stories. 2 of them are related, even though they don't appear to be when you look at them. And some commentaries don't link them, but I think they are. We're looking at the story of the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on water, and then some of the opposition he gets from the Pharisees about what his disciples are doing or not doing in a little parable. Now, remember, I've got the scripture passage over to my right. I got some notes in front of me down below, so I may be glancing down. Let's talk about scripture. Get your Bibles open to chapter 6, verse 30. Let's talk about what's going on. All right, now remember what Jesus has just done in the earlier part of chapter 6. Remember, he sent out the 12, sent out his 12. And as they were going out, that's when Mark takes the opportunity to tell this little story about John the Baptist. So as a good writer, it's kind of like the time is passing as the 12 are out there doing what Jesus told them to do, which is really what Jesus did. Again, message to us later. While they're doing that, Mark shifts and tells us a little story about Herod. Now when we get to verse 30, the apostles are back. Okay, and as soon as they come back, what does Jesus say to them? Okay, come to a deserted place. Now, really important to note, we've talked about it before. This deserted place has a lot of wilderness symbolism, right? So whenever Jesus is in a deserted place, we, the reader, can start thinking when he's in the desert, when he's in the wilderness, whenever they use terminology like that, we want to be alert for some Exodus imagery in what will follow, in the story that will follow. Mark's a good writer. He's integrating this into his story. Okay. And not only that, but they go to a deserted place, and Mark makes intentionally mentions that they weren't able to eat. Now, boom, this is like red flags are going up all over the place. If he's telling us they didn't have the chance to eat, there is a real good story. There's a good chance that what's going to happen in the story that follows. Right, it's going to have something to do with food. He's already setting us up for that. As you read the gospel, you might want to think about this. This is a guy writing a story about Jesus, and he's using, literary techniques to kind of guide us as he tells it. Okay, so they haven't had, they went away in a boat. Folks see him coming, right? And they recognize him, and what do? Okay, they go ahead of him. These people go ahead of him. Now, Mark doesn't tell us why. That's okay. We've got this crowd, all these people that are going ahead of him. In verse 34, he gets to the shore and sees what? What does he see when he gets to the shore? A great crowd. In Greek, the word is aklos. Man, we're going to see this aklos all over the place. And again, view it as undifferentiated. You don't have good folks in the crowd, bad folks. There was a slogan years ago about the army, be an army of one. Well, that's kind of crazy. Army is an aklos, is a crowd, is a group that is kind of undifferentiated. This isn't a crowd of individuals. This is a crowd where we assume everybody sort of has the same trait. At least that's how Mark is using it. Okay, so they come to a place, this deserted place, where we're ready for all this wilderness imagery, right? And he's doing his thing with them, and he teaches them many things. It grows late, and what does the evangelist tell us that Jesus wants his disciples to do? Well, it's late. The people haven't, or the disciples come to him. It's late. They're hungry. They need to get something to eat. Send them away to the villages. Send them to McDonald's, Burger King. Go. They need to get some fast food in them, right? And Jesus answers that. So the disciples tell him that. Jesus answers by really interesting. He says, "You give them something to eat." And they ask a question, and we've got the same story in Luke and Matthew, but actually we also have it in John. But in Luke and Matthew, we don't have this business about buying food, because he says, "Give them something to eat," and the disciples immediately say, "We can't do that, right? Are we to go and buy all this food?" And they use the number 200 denarii. And a denarii that's really important, because a denarii is a daily wage. You could buy enough food to feed yourself on a denarii a day. So when you talk about 200 denarii, that's a lot of money, that they're going to need to buy all this food. And so this is, even though it's not a question, and we've talked about that before, that had an implied answer, it was certainly a large number. And so Jesus, they say, "Man, there's a lot. It's going to cost a lot of money." Jesus says, ask them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And they found that they have how many loaves? They got 5 loaves, right? And they've got 2 fish. Now we look at that and say, "Oh, okay, 5 loaves, 2 fish. That's kind of interesting." Well, for ancient people, those numbers are kind of important. You see, ancient people put a real high stock on number. Numerology was a big deal in the ancient world. Remember, we're talking about kind of a pre-scientific world where you were looking for signs. I mean, geez Louise, they predicted the future by looking at the entrails of a chicken. Paying attention to numbers and stars and stuff, that's not unusual. And what these ancient folks were fascinated by were prime numbers that could only be divided by itself and 1. You see that a lot. That's why 3 is a big deal. 4 isn't, but 3 is. 4 is an earthly number, but 3 is a heavenly number. Prime numbers were really important. The number 7 is a big deal. Now I want you to look at this. We've got 5 loaves, 2 fish. Both 5 and 2 are what? Prime numbers, right? You add them together, what do you got? 7, right? And 7 is what? Another prime number. And so we've got the fact that he's got 5 loaves, 2 fish. Man, we are set up, if we're ancient folks, for something pretty important to happen. We got these now 3 prime numbers kind of squished together, right? All right, so they bring this stuff to him. And what does Jesus do with them? Okay, he takes the loaves in his hand and the fish in his hand, and he blesses them and breaks them. Now, as soon as we got Jesus breaking this bread, we as church-going Christians, we are experiencing deja vu all over again, right? He is breaking bread. When do we as Christians break bread? Geez, I should have had a V8. Of course. We do it at communion, right? Geez, so we've got this communion imagery. Now, before he does that, though, he has them sit down in groups. Guess who did that before? And remember, we're talking about being in the wilderness here, this Exodus imagery. Moses did it. So the same sort of thing happened to the people of Israel. And you talk about hungry. Is there Is there a story about Exodus and hunger? Well, duh, yeah, manna from heaven. People didn't have anything to eat. They complained about it. So we've got this lack of food. We've got this sitting in groups. We've got all of them Exodus imagery. He breaks the bread, which I think is a very intentional thing that he's doing. Mark's community, his church, as soon as the guy says this, because they're listening, they're not reading this, they're listening to somebody read the gospel, says Jesus broke bread, they're thinking, ooh, maybe that's where we got communion. Mark will give it a little stronger foundation a little bit later, but sure, he's appealing to an image that his audience already has. Okay, so he divides the food among them. They all eat, right? Good communion image. When you're serving communion, everybody eats, right? Everybody eats. Not only eats, but everybody is what? Full. Okay? Yes. Mark is tying this to a church practice, at least full spiritually. And in fact, not only are they full, they have food left over. And how much food do they have left over? 12 baskets. Well, again, this is like a Homer Simpson duh moment. Of course they got 12 baskets. 12 is an important number too. It's not a prime number, but it's an important number. Why is it important? Israel. Wilderness image. How many tribes of Israel did you have? 12, right? That's why you also have how many apostles? 12, okay? Got 12. Symbolically, what's happened? The people there were able to, and there are 5,000 of them, so there's a large group. Not only were they able to eat, but there was enough left over to fill 12 baskets for the 12 tribes. Symbolically, what Jesus is bringing here is, and again, establishing who he is as a Christ, is offering sustenance enough not only to take care of the crowd that's gathered, but also for the tribes, the children of Israel who aren't there. Symbolically, that may be something Mark is trying to convey in this story. Okay? And in a sense, Jesus is doing the same kind of thing that God did in terms of feeding the people that God did with the children of Israel in the wilderness, the 12 tribes. And all of that stuff should be floating around in our brain, that Mark is making some pretty dramatic and important identifications towards Jesus. He's identifying Jesus in some pretty powerful ways here. All right, so he does this, and this is just, he gets in a boat, goes there, does this miracle, gets back in the boat, and he is, or the disciples get into the boat, they're heading over to the other side. Jesus goes on a mountain to pray, and the disciples go on a boat. Now, I think this is a real subtle way to separate Jesus from his disciples. The disciples are there in a boat, Jesus is on a mountain praying. Mountains also have wilderness, carried this Exodus imagery, because who went on the mountain? Moses did. What happened? Got the 10 Commandments, close to God, yada, yada, yada. All right, so Jesus is on the mountain praying, the disciples are on the boat. Now, again, we've seen this story before, because when the evening came, they were out in a boat, right? And what's happening in the boat? Well, there's winds, right? They are straining against an adverse wind. Now, once more, we got deja vu all over again, right? Because we've been there in the 4th chapter. We had a story about Jesus and the disciples in water. You remember what that story was? Well, remember, Jesus, they're in the boat, only Jesus isn't separate from them. He's in the boat too. And there's this horrible storm, and the disciples say, don't you care that we're perishing? And Jesus says, you don't have faith, you don't trust enough, and he stilled the storm. Now, remember, we also said that when we looked at that story, we said that water is really important as a symbol, because water was at the beginning of creation. God brings order out of water. God brings order out of chaos. Water is a chaotic image. And when Jesus stilled the storm, he was exerting his authority over chaos. Or that's what we said, what the storm. Not only was it a miracle, but it was a dramatic miracle. A miracle over water is more dramatic than a miracle over dirt. Okay, we got another storm coming, right? We got the disciples, only this time Jesus isn't even there. They are fighting an adverse wind. What do they see? Who's coming to him? Jesus, right? And what is Jesus doing? Man, he's walking on the water. Now, that's kind of important, because not only did he have the power in this earlier story, in the 4th chapter, to still the storm, to calm the water down, now what is he doing? He's actually walking on the water. Now think about what that shows about Jesus. That not only does he have the power to still it, he has authority over the water. The water is under his feet. And when I use that term, it should bring maybe some Old Testament stuff, things are under God's feet. I think that is exactly what Mark is trying to say. In fact, the idea that Jesus' intention was to go past him, reflects something we see in the book of Exodus. Again, this wilderness imagery, right? All right, so he's walking on the water, and they cry out because they're terrified. They're not afraid, like astonished, but they feel terror. And what does he say? He says, "Take heart," and then it is I. Now, if you look at the Greek, that's a great translation of the Greek. But the Greek is ago me, which carries a little more weight than it is I. When you read it is I, it sounds like Jesus is just identifying himself, right? But ago me in Greek is the word, those are the words that God spoke from the burning bush when Moses was before the burning bush and asked God in the burning, the flames that weren't consuming the bush, when he says, "Who should I say sent me?" God's answer was ago me in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. I am. Tell him I am. Ago me. This is the word he uses here. Ago me. So even though it's a self-identification, it is I, which is accurate. Theologically, to a Jew, that carries a huge amount of weight. That's the name that the Greeks in the Old Testament used, the Greek translation of the Old Testament used for God. So it is making a powerful, powerful assertion. He gets into the boat. They're astonished, for they didn't understand the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Now that's kind of interesting, right? Because what is Mark suggesting? That somehow this walking on the water is connected with the healing with the loaves. Now, how might they be connected? Well, they're both using not only good Exodus imagery, but good Old Testament imagery. In both cases, Jesus is asserting a godlike authority. In the miracle of the loaves with the feeding of the 5,000 and the 12 baskets left, he is offering sustenance to his people just like God did with the children of Israel in the wilderness, as Jesus walks across the water and uses that name to identify himself, ago me. He is asserting authority over chaos and also claiming a name that belongs to God. I'll tell you, that name is so sacred that in Hebrew they wouldn't even say it out loud. So Mark is suggesting that Jesus is asserting an authority and identification with God. The disciples don't know it because it says their hearts were hardened. Now, that's a passive, which means it's not like they chose not to believe. Their hearts were hardened. Who hardens hearts? Well, God does. Right now, it's not the time for the disciples to recognize who Jesus is. That's going to come much later in the gospel. And that's after Jesus is sort of explained as the Son of God. Right now, he is this tremendous godlike miracle worker. But that's only, again, only half the story. So God prevents the disciples at this point from seeing exactly who Jesus is. Okay, he gets across, and when he gets across, verse 53, they get out of the boat. What happens? Okay, they're bringing the sick to him. This is Gennesaret, and the sick are being healed by just touching him. Now, we've seen that before. Remember last time when we talked about Jairus, and the woman in the crowd just touched his cloak and were healed. This is what's happening. So we've got Jesus as this sustainer. We've got Jesus as this person who asserts authority over chaos. We've got Jesus as the healer. Man, if you were in this story, what would you be thinking about Jesus? This is the man. This is the guy. Man, we're going to follow him. He is something special, right? All right. The antagonists enter the scene because in the beginning of chapter 7, who enters the picture? We've got Pharisees and we've got scribes, and they gather around him and they get upset. Now, Jesus has healed or fed 5,000 people, right? He has walked on water, for crying out loud, and he's healing folks, and all folks have to do is touch his shirt, and boom, they're healed. And what is ticking off the Pharisees? Are they saying, ooh, this stuff is really, really cool? What bothers them? The disciples are eating with what they call defiled hands. They're not washing them. They're not using Purell to clean their hands. They're just chowing down. Now, kind of important, this is a parallel story that we see in Matthew and Luke. Neither Matthew nor Luke mentions this about eating with defiled hands. And it may be because of what Mark felt he needed to do in verses 3 and 4. He needs to explain. He goes and explains what this tradition is. That tells us something about Mark's audience, right? They don't know this tradition. If they knew it, he wouldn't waste time explaining it. Maybe Matthew and Luke just don't want to spend the time. Remember, paper is expensive. Well, it's not even paper, it's the skin of reeds. That's really expensive. You don't want to waste it. Maybe as Matthew and Luke are editing Mark's story, they say, man, this doesn't enhance what's going to happen. This them being upset by them having dirty hands that you have to explain. And maybe we just drop it. Get the white out. We'll white it out. We won't do it. All right. So the Pharisees and the scribes, they ask him, why are your disciples not? Why don't they live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? Where's their focus? Is their focus on feeding 5,000, like God fed the children of Israel in the wilderness? Heck no. Is their focus on Jesus walking on the water, just like God asserted authority at creation? Heck no. Are they focused on Jesus healing folks? All they have to do is touch his shirt and they're healed? Heck no. What are they focused on? They are focused on the tradition of their fathers, this business about unhealed hands, or defiled hands. Same thing we've seen before. I mean, remember, they got ticked off because they were picking heads of grain, and eating seeds, eating like sesame seeds, not sesame seeds, but like sunflower seeds on the Sabbath. Can't be doing that. That's harvesting. They got upset because Jesus healed the guy with the withered hand on the Sabbath. Okay, now they're upset about this. And this, Jesus, or Mark using Jesus, uses it as a teaching moment. At first he quotes Isaiah. Now why do you think he would quote Isaiah to the Pharisee? In other words, by Mark including this, what is he telling us, the reader? Well, here are these guys that are saying, I'm objecting to you violating the rules of our fathers. And Jesus says, well, let me tell you what one of the greatest fathers of all, Isaiah, wrote. So what Mark is, by having this quote here, what ends up happening is we, the reader, we can kind of identify the scribes and the Pharisees for what they are. They're kind of hypocrites, and we're going to see that word used later, right? All right. And then Jesus, so he quotes this. So we got a negative view anyway, but then they really don't care about the traditions of the fathers. And then Jesus proves that by a real practical example. And the practical example involves the way they treat their parents. Now, it's what's the big deal about treating parents well? Well, 10 Commandments, right? Honor your father and mother. And what they say is, what Jesus is saying is, you don't treat your mama and daddy very well. You say you obey the law, but you got these loopholes. And the one that's really cool is you're supposed to. It's what Jesus is saying. Okay, you claim to obey the law, right? Yeah, we obey the law. All right, you claim to obey the law. You follow the law. The law says you need to take care of your mom and dad, right? Oh yeah, we do. Honor your father and mother. We do that all the time. I said, and Jesus said, but you put the loopholes in it. Your mom and daddy are poor. They ain't got nothing to eat, right? You got money to give them, right? But what do you do with the money? You say, this money I'm going to give to God. Therefore, I can't use it to help my mom and dad, even though they may starve. Duh, you're not taking care of your mom and dad. It doesn't matter just calling it an offering to God, the Corban, this is an offering I'm giving to God. You're justifying your lack of compassion towards them. You are not following the intention of the fathers. Jesus has already said that, right? When he healed the man with the withered hand, you remember what he said? Did God, who's the Lord of the Sabbath? You are. Well, the Sabbath was made for whom? You. You were. It was made for you. Do you do good or bad on the Sabbath? Man, you do good on the Sabbath. Same kind of thing going here. What you're doing is you're perverting the law because you're turning it against people. You're following this legalism that isn't the intention of the law at all. Now, Jesus is going to get even stronger later when he tells us exactly how you can judge all the law. Okay, so Jesus says this, confronts them, puts them in their place. They're kind of sheepish, I'm thinking. Turns to the crowd in verse 14, and he gives them, and we know it's a parable because it's called a parable later. He says this to them, listen to me, all of you, and understand there is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but things that come out that defile. That's the parable. The crowds hear it and say, well, that's really interesting. When are we going to get more fish? Bread and fish. So when the crowd leaves and the disciples kind of get together, they ask, what does this parable mean? What does this mean? There's nothing that defiles a person, nothing that goes in can defile a person but what comes out. Explain that. And Jesus was, in case you don't get the imagery, I'm talking about human biology. The real parable is food. What you eat it, goes to your stomach, and then what happens? Well, it let's just say it ends up in the sewer, right? Because it kind of passes through the system, right? This isn't like human caterpillar or anything like that. This just passes through the system, right? And he says, that's the imagery I want you to get. It's not what goes in, it's what comes out. You don't want to be collecting what comes out, right? You want to get rid of it because it's nasty. What comes in is pretty good, but what comes out is nasty, and that's what you need to grasp. Now, Mark, as he sees this, says, Jesus is saying all food is clean. That's in little parentheses. Well, guess what? Luke and Matthew don't include that. So they don't interpret that comment about food going in and coming out. They don't interpret that as meaning all food is clean. That certainly wasn't the case with Luke, because in Luke, I'm thinking in Acts, I'm thinking chapter 14, there's this apostolic council where they say not all food is clean. You know, there's some food that you shouldn't eat, like food offered to idols and food that has blood in it. You know, you don't eat carrion. You know, though you don't do that. You know, so Luke doesn't believe all food is clean, but Mark does. So that's kind of Mark giving his own interpretation here that Matthew and Luke eliminate because they don't believe it. Okay, so it's not what goes in, it's what comes out. And what comes out? Whoa, this is good stuff. What's coming out of the human heart? It's not what goes in. You know, that's just stuff. It's what comes out. You know, like all evil intentions, fornication, which is a whole range of sexual sins, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, in other words, greed, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. These come from within and defile a person. Now that's kind of interesting, because this is Jesus is talking about attitude and behavior, and it's the attitude and behavior that causes these attitudes that cause people to do things that are really nasty, that are defiling, that hurt others, that violate the intention. It's not whether you eat a sandwich with dirty hands. That doesn't defile you. But I'll tell you something, if you got bread and peanut butter and you see your neighbor starving and you don't give him a sandwich because you're greedy, you got to keep it for yourself, or you don't like him, or you're proud, or whatever. That's defiling. It's not the dirty hands eating. It's not sharing. It's not loving. I think you could kind of use an image comparable to money. You know, that a lot of people talk about money, dirty money. We went through a long period here where I live about some money being dirty because it came from gambling casinos, and therefore dirty money and churches shouldn't accept it. I think what Jesus is saying, and it's not, he doesn't focus on money, but I think you can apply it to that. What Jesus is saying is the money itself isn't dirty. It's not dirty. It's just money. It's not clean. It's not dirty. It's just money. You know, it's currency. It's what you do with it that's going to be good or bad. It's what you do with it, with the money, that makes it dirty. I mean, if you use it to hire a hitman to kill your spouse, that's bad. You know, if you use it to pay for some advertising to promote a product that doesn't work, or to promote some kind of lie, that's bad. If you use it to slander somebody, that's bad. If you use it to boost your ego, that's defiling. That's using the money in a bad way. And that, I think, that's Jesus's point here. Now, important lesson, something that can be applied later. We don't want to become distracted, let that distract us from the main point Mark is making in these three stories. That Jesus as the Christ, sustainer, authority over chaos, a godlike authority over chaos, you know, has power over sicknesses, has authority over the scribes and the Pharisees. If you were around Jesus, if you were part of this crowd, or even part of the 12, what would you be thinking about Jesus? Man, he is the greatest thing since sliced bread. In fact, he can provide some sliced bread. All you need is 5 loaves, and he can provide all the sliced bread you want. This guy is great. Again, Mark is establishing what it means to say Jesus is the Christ. Boom. Spectacular. But remember, only half the story. In what we're going to look at in the next section, probably sometime next week, later part of next week, we're going to be finishing up the first half of Mark, which means I'm going to show you the one verse that you can draw a line after, and after that verse, we're done with part one. We got the little prologue, part one, Jesus is the Christ. From that point on, what Mark is going to be doing as he shapes his story is he's going to be talking about Jesus as the Son of God. So you want to tune in next week. I'm so glad you listened. Man, I am enjoying these so much. I love this kind of stuff. I hope you're getting something out of it too. Remember, until I talk with you again, you are a child of God, and God loves you very much. Goodbye.